A medieval chronicle for sleep. This is a slow chronicle for rest, a gentle telling of medieval life, spoken softly for deep and uninterrupted sleep, wherever you are in the world right now, and whatever time it happens to be for you. There is nothing you need to do and nothing you need to stay awake for. Simply allow this quiet chronicle to continue as the night carries you gently toward rest. In the centuries when stone walls rose thick against the wind, there lived ordinary people whose days unfolded in rhythms we might barely recognize now. Their world moved at the pace of walking. It moved at the pace of oxen pulling wooden plows through heavy soil. Lives were measured not in minutes, but in the broad movements of dawn and dusk. Time was the hours it took for bread to rise near the warmth of a hearth. Time was the patient waiting for water to heat over glowing embers. In a village that might have stood anywhere in that vast medieval landscape, morning arrived not with alarms, but with the first gray light. It came seeping through gaps in shuttered windows. It came with the sound of a rooster somewhere in the distance. There was the subtle shift from the deep silence of night to the quiet stirring of a household beginning to wake. A woman might rise first. Her feet would find the cool, packed earth of the floor. Her hands would reach for the woolen cloak she had folded near the bed. She would move slowly through the dimness toward the central hearth, where embers from the previous evening still held a faint orange glow beneath the ash. She would kneel there. Her movements were unhurried. With a stick, she would carefully uncover those embers. She coaxed them back to small flames with dry kindling kept nearby in a basket. She watched as the fire gradually accepted the new wood. The flames began to spread their warmth into the room. Light followed. Slowly behind. The house itself was a simple structure. Its walls were made of timber, wattle, and daub. That ancient combination of wooden framework was filled with woven branches. Everything was covered over with a thick mixture of clay, straw, and dung. All of it was smoothed together. All of it dried to create walls that kept out most of the wind. They kept out most of the rain. The roof above was thatched with bundles of straw laid in overlapping rows. It might let in a fine mist during the heaviest storms. Still, it provided shelter enough for the family who lived beneath it. The floor was simply earth, packed hard by years of footsteps. Sometimes it was covered with rushes or straw. These could be swept out when they grew too soiled or damp. There was one main room where most of life happened. Here the family cooked. They ate here. They worked here. They gathered in the evenings in this space. Perhaps there was a smaller space partitioned off where they. As the fire grew stronger, the woman might fill an iron pot with water. The water came from a large clay vessel near the door. Someone had carried it from the village well the day before. She would hang this pot on an iron hook suspended over the flames. It would begin its slow progress toward warmth while she moved about other tasks. Her husband might be waking now. Their children stirred in their beds. Soon there would be the quiet sounds of A household coming to life, the rustling of straw mattresses, the soft voices of children whispering to each other, the creaking of wooden shutters being opened to let in the pale early light. Breakfast was a simple affair, perhaps some bread left from the previous day. It was hard, dark, and dense. This was the kind of bread made from rye or barley or a mixture of grains. It was torn into pieces. It was softened in weak ale or in the warm water that had been heating over the fire. There might be a bit of cheese kept wrapped in cloth. There might be some onions. In fortunate times there was a little bacon hanging in the rafters where the smoke from the fire would help preserve it. The family would gather near the hearth. They ate quietly. Their movements were slow with the early hour. When the simple meal was finished, the day's work would begin in earnest. The man might take up his tools. He would head out to the fields that lay beyond the village. Those long strips of land had been assigned to him for cultivation. He walked along paths worn smooth by countless feet. He passed other cottages where smoke was beginning to rise from roof openings. He passed the church with its stone walls and small bell tower. He passed the miller's house where the sound of the water wheel could already be heard turning in the stream. The fields stretched out in their medieval pattern. Long, narrow strips were separated by grassy margins. A man might tend several such strips scattered across the village lands. Some lay in one field, some lay in another. All were part of the ancient rotation that kept the soil from exhausting itself entirely. In spring he would plow. He walked behind his ox or his borrowed ox. He guided the wooden plow with its iron, tip through the earth. The plow turned long furrows that glistened darkly in the morning light. The work was hard. The work was slow. He might cover only a small portion of ground in a day. In summer, he would tend the growing crops. He pulled weeds. He watched the weather. He hoped for rain, but not too much rain. He hoped for sun, but not such fierce sun that everything withered. In autumn he would harvest. He cut grain with a sickle. He bundled it into sheaves. He worked from dawn until the light failed. Because the harvest time was short. The harvest time was precious. Everything depended on bringing in the crops before the weather turned. Back in the cottage, the woman's day unfolded in its own patterns of work. These patterns varied with the seasons. They always involved endless tasks performed with patient hands. Everything required quiet concentration about the room. Sometimes she sat near the doorway where the light was better. Her fingers automatically maintained the tension. They maintained the twist that would create thread strong enough for weaving. There was flax to be processed if they grew flax. Those blue-flowered plants would be pulled. They would be retted. They would be broken. They would be combed until the fibers could be spun into linen thread. All of this took time, so much time. Hours became days, became weeks of work to create enough thread to weave cloth for. A single garment. There was always food to be prepared. The preparations were different from anything we might imagine now. Everything was done from the very beginning. Everything was done slowly over fire or in the open air. Grain had to be ground into flour. Unless the family could afford to take it to the Lord's mill, this meant grinding it at home with a hand quern, 2 round stones, one on top of the other. The upper stone turned round while. Grain trickled between them. Rough flour came out along the edges. Bread had to be mixed. It had to be kneaded. It was left to rise if there was yeast or leaven. Sometimes it was baked flat without rising. Then it had to be baked either in the ashes of the fire or in a communal oven if the village had one. The bread was carried there on wooden paddles. It was watched carefully so it would not burn. Vegetables had to be gathered from the small garden plot near the house. Those cabbages, leeks, peas, and beans supplemented the grain that formed the basis of every meal. They had to be cleaned. They had to be chopped. They were added to the pot of pottage that simmered over the fire. That thick mixture contained whatever was available. Grains, vegetables, perhaps a bone for flavor. It was stirred occasionally through the day. It was ladled out at mealtimes into wooden bowls. There were children to be minded. This too was work that threaded through all the other work. The youngest. Ones were kept close, kept out of danger. The older ones were given small tasks to help with the household. They gathered firewood from the edges of the forest. They carried water from the well. They watched over the geese or the pig that rooted near the cottage. They learned by watching. They learned by doing. They absorbed all the skills they would need when they grew older, when they had their own households to manage. A daughter might sit beside her mother learning to spin. Her small fingers were clumsy at first with the spindle. Gradually, she gained the rhythm of it. She gained the feel of it. A son might follow his father to the fields. He would learn to scatter seed. He would learn to stack sheaves. He would learn to sharpen tools against a whetstone. All the knowledge passed down not through formal teaching, but through shared work, through patient repetition. The church bells marked the passing of the day. They rang out the hours for prayers. Not everyone stopped their work to pray at each appointed time. Still, the bells were a constant reminder of the rhythm that governed medieval life, a rhythm in which sacred time wove together with ordinary time, was a little cleaner, perhaps a little less patched and mended. They would stand through the long mass in the dim interior. Candles flickered before images of saints painted on the walls. The priest spoke in Latin that most of them did not understand. The familiar rituals unfolded in their timeless pattern. Afterward, they might linger in the churchyard. They talked with neighbors. They shared news. They watched the children play. Then they walked slowly home again to the rest of the day. The manor house stood on higher ground overlooking the village. It was built of stone if the Lord was wealthy. It was built of timber if he was not. Most villagers entered it rarely, if at all. They saw it from a distance as a reminder of the Lord's presence, a reminder of his authority. A few times a year they might be called there to fulfill their obligations, to give portions of their harvest as rent, to perform labor on the Lord's own lands, to attend the manor court where disputes were settled, where rules were enforced. The Lord himself might be present. He might be away, perhaps serving his own Lord in some military capacity, perhaps visiting other estates. In his absence, his steward or bailiff would manage the manor's affairs. Records were kept carefully. Who owed what? Who had paid? Who had not? Everything was recorded on rolls of parchment. They would be stored away. They would be consulted when needed. As the day moved toward afternoon, the quality of light would change. It grew warmer. It grew more golden. It slanted through the open doorways. It illuminated the dust that hung in the air. The work continued in its steady rhythm. A woman might move outside to tend the garden. She pulled weeds from among the vegetables. She checked the bean plants climbing their supports of hazel sticks. She gathered herbs for cooking or for medicine. Perhaps lavender, perhaps thyme or sage. Their scents rose in the warm air. She might feed the chickens that scratched in the yard. She scattered handfuls of grain. She collected eggs from the nesting boxes. Or she might check on the pig. The pig was such an important part of the household. Economy. The pig ate scraps. It foraged. It would be slaughtered in autumn to provide meat for the winter, to provide fat for the winter. In the workshop of a craftsman, if the village was large enough to support such specialists, the afternoon might be filled with the particular sounds of that craft, the particular rhythms of that work. A blacksmith would tend his forge. He heated iron in the glowing coals. He hammered it on his anvil. The ringing blows echoed across the village as he shaped horseshoes, as he shaped tools, as he shaped the iron. Fittings needed for carts, for plows. A potter would turn his wheel. He formed clay into vessels, into bowls, jugs, and cooking pots. Each one was shaped by hand. Each was left to dry before being fired in a kiln. His fingers knew exactly how thick the walls should be. They knew exactly how to curve the rim. This was knowledge learned through long apprenticeship, through constant practice. The monastery on the hill beyond the village kept its own different rhythm, one marked even more strictly by the hours of prayer that divided each day, that divided each night. The monks rose in darkness for the first prayers. Their voices joined in the chanted psalms in the cold stone chapel. They returned to that chapel again through the day. Between these services, they worked in the fields that belonged to the monastery, or they copied manuscripts in the scriptorium, or they tended the sick in the infirmary, or they prepared meals in the kitchen. All of it was done in silence or near silence. All of it was offered as prayer. Their lives were dedicated to a routine that had been followed for centuries, that would continue for centuries more. In the village, the long afternoon gradually softened toward evening. As the sun moved lower in the sky, those who had been working in the fields would begin to make their way home. They carried their tools over their shoulders. They walked slowly along the familiar paths. They paused perhaps to exchange a few words with a neighbor. They stopped at the well for a drink of water. The children who had been watching over geese or cattle would drive their charges back toward the village. They called out to keep them moving. They directed them toward pens or barns, or simply to the open areas where they could be secured for the night. The woman would be thinking about the evening meal. She checked the pot over the fire. Perhaps she added more water, perhaps more vegetables. She tore bread into pieces She set out the wooden bowls. She set out the spoons that served for dishes, simple tools that had been carved by hand, smoothed by use. When the family gathered for the evening meal, they would sit together near the hearth where the fire provided warmth, where it provided light. They would eat their pottage. They would eat their bread, perhaps some cheese, perhaps some fruit, if it was the season for apples, for pears, for berries. They would drink ale. It was safer than water. Even children drank it, though theirs might be weaker than what the adults drank. They would talk about the day, about the work accomplished, about the work still to be done, about news heard in the village, about plans for the morrow. The conversation would be quiet. It would be intermittent. It was broken by comfortable silences. As the light outside faded completely, as darkness settled over the land, they would move closer to the fire. They were drawn to its warmth. They were drawn to its light, as humans have always been drawn to fire, since the first flames flickered in ancient caves. Sometimes a traveling storyteller or minstrel might arrive in the village. He offered entertainment in exchange for food, in exchange for shelter. Then there might be a gathering of neighbors to hear tales of distant lands, tales of ancient heroes, tales of saints and their miracles. Stories were told in the flickering firelight with dramatic gestures, with changes of voice, stories that would be remembered long after the storyteller had moved on to the next village, long after he had been forgotten himself. But most evenings were quiet. They ended when the fire had burned low, when sleep was pulling at tired bodies. The family would secure the house for the night. They made sure the door was barred. They banked the fire so that embers would last until morning. They checked that all was safe, that all was in order. They would make their way to their sleeping places. Perhaps they said a final prayer. Perhaps they simply lay down in the darkness. They pulled blankets over themselves, blankets woven from wool or stitched from old clothing, whatever could provide warmth against the cold. Then the house would grow still. It would grow silent except for the small sounds of settling timbers, except for the breathing of sleepers. Perhaps the wind moved around the eaves. Perhaps an animal stirred outside. But mostly there was quiet. There was rest. The seasons turned in their eternal cycle. They brought their different labors. They brought their different gifts. Spring came with mud. It came with rain. It came with the exhausting work of plowing and planting. Lambs were born in the fields. Calves were born in the barn. The world turned green again after the gray of winter. Summer brought long days. It brought the constant care of growing crops. There was worry about weather. There were the first fruits ripening in the orchards. There was the sweet, brief time of abundance before the hard work of harvest. Autumn was a time of gathering, a time of preserving, of bringing in the grain, of threshing it on the barn floor, of slaughtering animals, of salting the meat, of smoking the meat, of storing everything that would be needed to survive the coming winter. Winter itself was a time of endurance, of making do with what had been stored, of huddling near fires, of shorter days, of longer nights, of waiting for spring to come round again. Through all these seasons, the manor and village continued in their ancient patterns, patterns that had evolved over centuries, patterns that seemed as permanent as the land itself, though in truth they were always slowly changing, always adapting to new circumstances, to new people, to the gradual shifts in society that were happening even in that seemingly unchanging medieval world. A young couple would marry. They would establish their own household. They received a small plot of land from the Lord in exchange for their labor, in exchange for their rent. Children would be born. They would be raised. They would themselves have children. The endless human cycle continued. Records, if such records were kept, or perhaps they were remembered only by those who had known them. Eventually, they were forgotten. As those too passed away, new generations took their place. In the monastery, the same cycles continued, though in a different form. A young man might arrive seeking to become a novice. He left behind his family. He left behind his former life. After a time of testing, after a time of learning, he would take his vows. He would become a full member of the community. He would spend his days in prayer, in work, following the rule that governed every aspect of monastic life. He might spend his entire life there, growing old within those stone walls, never again venturing into the outside world. His life, a quiet devotion that left no mark except in the prayers he offered, except in the work he performed, except in the example he provided to his brothers. Sometimes great events would touch even these quiet villages. News arrived of wars in distant places, of kings and their conflicts, of plagues sweeping across the land, of changes in the church, of changes in laws, of changes in the great powers that shaped the world. These events might bring fear, they might bring hardship, they might require young men to serve in armies, they might bring disease or famine, they might disrupt the familiar patterns, they might force adaptation, they might force change. But for the most part, life in the village continued in its accustomed rhythms. It was shaped more by weather than by the doings of the great. It was shaped more by seasons than by kings. The ordinary people whose names were never recorded in chronicles lived out their lives in these small places. They found meaning in their work, in their families, in their communities, in their faith. The stone church stood solid in the center of the village. Within it, the daily round of prayers continued. The daily round of services continued, regardless of what was happening in the world outside. The priest lived in a small house near the church. He was supported by the tithes paid by villagers. A tenth of their produce was given to support the church, to support its needs. He would say Mass on Sundays, on feast days. He would baptize the newly born. He would marry those who came to him seeking the blessing of the church on their union. He would pray over the dying. He would bury the dead. He would hear confessions. He would offer what comfort he could to his parishioners, what guidance he could. His life was not so different from theirs in many ways. He too lived simply. He worked his own small plot of land. He ate the same basic foods. He was subject to the same hardships, though he had the education that came with his position, the ability to read Latin, to understand the sacred texts, the authority that his office provided. As night deepened, the village settled into sleep. The world outside the cottages was very dark, darker than we can easily imagine, and now there were no street lights, no electric glow, nothing but occasional starlight when it was cloudy. There was a darkness so complete that a person could barely see their hand before their face. In this darkness, the village seemed to withdraw into itself, each family secure in their own dwelling. The animals bedded down in barns, in pens, the whole settlement quiet except for the occasional bark of a dog, except for the cry of an owl hunting in the nearby fields. The world seemed larger in that darkness, more mysterious, more filled with possibilities both wonderful and frightening. It was easy to believe in the stories of spirits, of strange creatures that might walk abroad when humans were safely asleep. But morning would come again, as it always did, the first gray light returning, the roosters crowing, the birds beginning their dawn chorus. The whole cycle would begin once more, day following day, in an endless procession that was both monotonous and infinitely varied. The same tasks repeated, but never exactly the same way twice. Each day brought its own small challenges, its own small triumphs, its own moments of difficulty, its own moments of satisfaction. This was medieval life for most people. Not a time of knights and tournaments, not a time of grand adventures, though such things existed at the edges of their awareness. Rather, it was a life of patient labor, of simple pleasures, of endurance, of adaptation, of finding meaning in family, in community, in the rhythms of work and prayer that structured their days. The fields beyond the village stretched away toward distant forests, those remnants of the great wildwood that had once covered so much of the land. They still provided timber. They provided game. They provided grazing for pigs in autumn when the acorns fell. The forest was a resource, but also a place of mystery, a place of danger. Wolves might still be found there. Outlaws might hide there. A person could easily become lost among the trees if they ventured too far from the familiar paths. Children were warned not to go too deep into the woods alone. People moved through the forest with a certain wary respect. They gathered what they needed. They were always aware that they were in a place not entirely tamed, not entirely safe. In the furthest fields, where the cultivated lands gave way to rough pasture, shepherds might spend their days watching over flocks of sheep. Those patient animals whose wool was so essential, whose meat was so essential, whose milk was so essential to medieval life. A shepherd's existence was solitary, sometimes lonely. He was out in all weathers. He was responsible for keeping the flock safe from predators, safe from thieves. He moved them to fresh grazing. He brought them back each evening to pens near the village. He might have a simple hut out on the pasture where he could shelter from rain. He had a dog to help him with his work, an intelligent dog that understood commands, that could keep the sheep moving in the right direction. Together, they would watch over their charges from dawn to dusk, day after day through the passing. The miller was an important figure, one of the few specialists in a community where most people did similar work. People both needed him and sometimes resented the fees he charged, the portions of flour he kept as payment for his services. But without the mill, each family would have to grind all their grain by hand. So they came with their sacks of wheat, with their sacks of rye or barley. They waited their turn. They carried away their flour to make the bread that would sustain them through the coming weeks. And so the chronicle of medieval life continues, not in great events, but in these small daily realities, in the texture of lived experience, in the sound of a hoe striking earth, in the smell of bread baking, in the feel of wool growing soft between practiced fingers, in the sight of smoke rising from cottage roofs in the early morning, in the taste of ale drunk from a wooden cup, in the weight of exhaustion at day's end, in all the countless details that made up a life in those distant centuries when time moved differently, when people measured their days by sun and season rather than by clock and calendar, when communities were small and closely bound, when work was hard but its purpose was clear, when the patterns of life had a rhythm that had been tested through countless generations, patterns that would eventually give way to new ways of living, but that in their own time provided a framework within which ordinary people could build their lives, could raise their families, could find their small happinesses, could endure their sorrows, and pass quietly into sleep each night, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same, the endless, familiar round of work and rest, of effort and reward, of the slow procession of days that was simply life as they knew it, life as their parents had known it, life as they expected their children would know it, the world turning slowly, the seasons following their appointed course, the church bells marking the hours, and through it all the patient, enduring presence of ordinary human beings doing what humans have always done, trying to survive, trying to make things a little better, trying to find meaning and connection in the brief span of years given to them. Their names mostly forgotten now, but their lives no less real for that forgetting, no less filled with hope and fear and love and pain, no less deserving of being remembered and honored in the quiet telling that continues even now as darkness deepens and sleep approaches and the ancient rhythms carry us gently toward rest.